This week we're going to be discussing Interpreting for Religious and Performing Arts by Frankie Short,
Rencia Graves Sandy,
and TJ Gray.
First, we're going to be discussing interpreting in musical settings. What is musical interpreting? Basically, it would be interpreting music. Music isn't exactly what it seems to be. It's more complex. It's not just the lyrics on a piece of paper being sung or performed. It's a person conveying their emotions and feelings through song. In order to effectively interpret this, you need to understand music and the performer. That way you can act this out not only through your signs, but through your face and your body. There's many different places that you can interpret music. The most common ones are music concerts and festivals. So any performer, their concert. But there's also theme parks. Disney World has shows. All the different theme parks have shows. Then there's also cruise ships, which have performances. And then Broadway and anything else you can think of. In order to effectively interpret music, you need to prepare. You can't just get up on stage and start interpreting. Music is a very complex thing. First, you need to get a copy of the lyrics weeks before you be interpreting and analyze the lyrics. A lot of times, the English lyrics are metaphors, and you need to be able to take the metaphor, figure out exactly what the performer is trying to say in English, and then interpret that into sign language. Memorizing the words to the lyrics is very helpful because when you're standing there interpreting, there's a lot going on. There's the lyrics, and then there's also the performer whose emotions you're trying to convey, and you're trying to put all this into sign language all very quickly. If you have the lyrics memorized, then it's going to be a lot easier on you. If there's a lot of songs back to back, for example, at a concert where there might be 10, 20 songs, then it's okay to have the lyrics on a music stand in front of you. That way it's not so overwhelming to memorize everything. A lot of times before you're going to interpret for a certain artist, you're going to want to attend one of their concerts or rehearsals or something. That way you can see how they perform. It's very important that when you're interpreting for them, you're able to convey their emotions into your interpretation. That way the deaf person has a full understanding. A lot of times when a performer is singing, their entire face, their body, everything is involved. And you want to be able to portray that through your interpretation. If you can get all their songs into a CD, all the songs that you have to interpret, that's very helpful because you can just practice with that. You can listen to it, figure out the meaning. What makes a good musical interpreter? Well, music is a hearing art form. It's not really part of deaf culture, so this makes interpreting music a little bit more difficult. First of all, you need to be really fluent in American Sign Language and know all about that language, because not only are you interpreting music with your hands through American Sign Language, you also need to use your entire face and body and make sure that you have really good expressions. You're not always going to be right in front of the deaf people, so you need to make sure that your facial and body expressions are very clear and very bold. And then also, if you're good at memorizing lyrics, that can definitely help you because it's less looking down at the paper and you know what's going on. Where does the interpreter stand? In these pictures, you can see that interpreters will either stand right in front of the stage, in front of the performer, or off to the side. A lot of times they'll have like their own mini stage. Before the performance, you'll probably have a chance to talk with the deaf consumer and figure out where they feel comfortable with you standing. A lot of times at like different events, the deaf person might feel more comfortable with you standing up on a stage if they're further back, or on the ground if they're closer. That way they can see you better. There's a company called Lotus Sign. It's actually one of the few agencies that hires performance and live music interpreters. These interpreters are trained through the company after they've been certified and everything, and then they go to different concerts and they interpret these. They're one of the best agencies for this in the country. They're based in Texas. Provided is a link to their website and also their YouTube trailer. They also have many videos on YouTube of them interpreting in different situations, different concerts, and their interpreters are really amazing. They have about, I think, 4 full-time interpreters and their understudy. They're really awesome. You should check them out.
Okay, next we're going to talk to you about interpreting in theatrical settings. Now, interpreters have different placement options within theater. Standing stationary is where the interpreter stands off to the side in front of the stage. For those that did not go to see the Laramie Project that TJ and Miss Williams performed in, it was an interpreted show whereby 5 interpreters sat off to the side of the stage. And it is not the most ideal setting because the deaf consumer must choose between watching the action on stage and the interpretation. The next placement option is called zone interpreting. The practitioner interprets the dialogue being delivered by actors anytime they enter the interpreter zone. Again, not the ideal placement option because visually it can become confusing, and for one character being portrayed, there are at least 3 interpreters, and it can lose the character's consistency. However, the deaf audience can simultaneously watch both the action and interpretation. Lastly, there's shadow interpreting, where the interpreter becomes part of the show, personifying the actor's alter ego. Here's an example of zone interpreting, and you can see that the interpreter in zone 1 and the interpreter in zone 2. So if you have an actor in zone 1 that crosses the stage into zone 2, then zone 1's interpreter will stop interpreting, and then zone 2 interpreter will begin interpreting. So it can kind of get a bit confusing. Okay, the 2 effective ways to interpret in a theatrical setting is to either use the double stage approach, which you will see on the next slide is a picture, and there's also a picture in your book. And there are literally 2 stages, one with deaf actors signing lines on one stage and actors speaking on another. The other is having deaf actors being accompanied with voice interpretation for each deaf character. And here's an example of double stage approach. There are no standard qualifications with interpreting in theatrical settings. However, it is recommended that interpreters take theater courses such as character development or script analysis. The interpreter should understand the interaction between actors, also blocking. And blocking is a theater term which basically describes the process of the director positioning the actor's movements around the stage. And also the interpreter should possess the highest translation skills. Also in interpreting in theatrical settings, since there's no supervision under the setting, interpreters usually depend on each other for feedback. Interpreters have to take into consideration theatrical aspects. For example, an interpreter should be involved with rehearsals as well as prepping by studying the script. As Frankie mentioned earlier with interpreting for concerts, the interpreter would want to obtain the lyrics, and just as if you're interpreting a play, the interpreter should obtain the script. Interpreters also must consider the use of stage makeup so deaf consumers could better see grammatical features. Clothing or costumes being worn by the interpreter should not blend in with backgrounds and should complement the actor's costumes. For example, if an interpreted play for The Lion King was happening on Broadway in New York, the interpreter could be dressed as one of the animals on stage. Also, interpreters must consult with the deaf consumers for services. Again, this field is relatively new for interpreters, therefore you have to represent yourself as an interpreter. This includes, but not limited to, obtaining the script, payment options, proper lighting, contracting enough interpreters for a lengthy play and number of characters, and payment to deaf consultants for advertisement. When receiving pay for interpreting in this field, sometimes interpreters are either encouraged to join an actors union, which is a labor union that represents actors in regard to their pay and auditions and liabilities, or you must set your own wages along the lines of what the actors receive for compensation. In a community theater, since everyone's a volunteer, such as the director and the actors, that's including the interpreter. So community theater, usually your services are volunteered. Sometimes inappropriate gestures like grabbing of the bottom of the interpreter can take place on the stage. And when that happens, the interpreter must stay in role or he or she will become a nuisance to the art. It's acceptable for interpreters to interact with the actors because you have to remember, as the interpreter, you are there to complement the performers and support authentic access for deaf and hard of hearing audience members. And here is a link provided by a theater company named Wild Swan Theater, and you'll see a few examples of shadow interpreting.
Next, we're going to talk about interpreting in religious settings. First, you need to know what is a religious setting. According to RID's standard practice paper, a religious setting is when there is anything that is spiritual in nature. The four most frequently interpreted religious categories of events are liturgical services, funerals, weddings, and special events. There are no standard qualifications for interpreting in religious settings, which could be one of the reasons entry-level interpreters often work in this setting. Interpreters are encouraged to work with a mentor who is seasoned and/or a certified interpreter before working alone. Professionals interpreting in a religious setting should have fluency in a signed language, like ASL or signed English, and a spoken language. They should also have knowledge of a source language of an original scriptural text, such as Arabic, Hebrew, Latin, or any other that would enhance the overall interpretation. It is ideal to have familiarity with the sacred text, although the interpreter may need to work with a translation in their first language. Interpreters in religious settings should have access to and be familiar with specialized vocabulary, both signed and spoken, that relate to the specific setting. Texts that are specific to the setting, for example, the Quran, Torah, or the Bible. Materials used including the sermon, notes, homilies, and multimedia presentations. You should have prior communication with a specific on-site contact who has access to all of the materials, equipment, and venues needed for the event. Advanced preparation will vary for each interpreter. Some events may require weeks of analyzing text, music, consulting experts in the ideology or beliefs of the setting. Some events may require team interpreting, which means more advanced preparation is needed. Materials include music, sacred text or readings, and their translations. Materials can be printed and/or recorded. You will also need to have any lists of names that may be read, the agenda, announcements, copies of sermons, speeches, poetry, scripts of any artistic performances or songs. Interpreter placement may vary. It is important to consider acoustics, sight lines, lighting, background, location, and availability of equipment. Special consideration should be given to the accepted protocols of the religion. The interpreter should also be sensitive to space for a music stand to place materials, gender roles, areas deemed sacred, videotaping, and physical movement inherent to the service. This is one example of where an interpreter may stand during a service. Here is an example of interpreter placement for a wedding ceremony. Some interpreters may feel that their interpreting is a service or ministry and may not expect payment. There are some situations when interpreters do not charge anything, but may want to consider informing the religious community of the potential expenses of interpreter services. Some interpreters accept payment, but may donate it back to the religious organization. Interpreters should be aware of their own beliefs and how they may potentially conflict with the beliefs of a different faith. If you accept an assignment in a religious setting, you should be able to faithfully and impartially interpret the message. And this concludes our presentation.